In part 1, Karp and Zimiska argue that American leaders, especially in Silicon Valley, have lost sight of a broader national purpose. They contrast earlier eras when innovators worked hand-in-hand with government to drive progress with today's focus on profit and consumer technology. This focus has led to a weakening of the deep values and collective ideas that once helped define the country. This background sets the stage for Part 2, which explains how the American mind has hollowed out. Part 2 consists of chapters 5 to 9. Let's dive in. Chapter 5, The Abandonment of Belief. This chapter opens by describing the controversial 1976 Skokie case, where the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, defended the free speech rights of a Nazi group in a town with many Jewish residents. Although this decision led thousands to leave the ACLU, its director, Aria Neher, insisted that even disagreeable views must be protected under the First Amendment. Karp and Zimiska use this example to highlight a past when individuals risked their reputation for principle. They contrast it with another incident at Yale in 1963, when civil rights advocate Pauli Murray defended segregationist George Wallace's right to speak, despite her personal history of racial injustice. Neher and Murray both went against their personal beliefs, but they defended the right to free speech because they believed that protecting free speech was essential to limiting state power and preserving democratic values. This reflects a time when society cared more about defending the constitutional principles despite being subjected to personal attacks. The authors then draw a parallel with modern times, citing the 2023 congressional hearings with university presidents from Harvard, Penn, and MIT. Their measured, legalistic responses, such as Elizabeth McGill's remark that hateful speech is context-dependent, reflect a reluctance to speak with moral conviction. Karp and Zimiska argue that today's leaders are overly cautious, choosing self-preservation over taking principled stands. This environment, marked by intense media scrutiny and a fear of public backlash, has led to an overall decline in authentic, risk-taking belief. This chapter concludes by suggesting that this trend affects all areas of leadership, including in Silicon Valley, where companies tend to avoid engaging in deep, controversial issues. The current generation of Silicon Valley elites have abandoned beliefs and opt to be non-controversial. Chapter 6, Technological Agnostics. Many Silicon Valley leaders have become technological agnostics, individuals who refuse to commit to any clear moral or political stance. They explain that while ideals like justice are celebrated, few are willing to embrace a specific national or cultural allegiance. Amy Gutman, a Princeton professor in the 1980s and 90s, argued justice should be the priority over having beliefs that belong to any particular community or nation. This mindset leads tech founders to focus on innovation for its own sake, without connecting their work to broader societal goals. For example, Mark Zuckerberg's motivation in building Facebook was simply because it is enjoyable. This reflects a common attitude among tech leaders who prefer a flexible, non-committal stance rather than taking risks on controversial projects. As we touched on in Part 1, Google withdrew from Project Maven, a military project, after employees protested, illustrating the widespread hesitance to engage with defense work. The unwillingness to commit to a larger purpose results in a generation of technologists who remain neutral, which leaves important questions of national purpose unanswered. Chapter 7, A Balloon Cut Loose. In the 1960s and 70s, many colleges, including Stanford, gradually eliminated courses on Western civilization. Traditionally, these courses introduced students to influential ideas from figures like Plato, Dante, and Marx. This provided a sense of history and national unity about what it means to be a part of the West. Critics of the curriculum argued that it was outdated and exclusionary. The main arguments were, why are only some certain figures included and not others? And that the West is made up of diverse figures, so it should not only include certain figures. Reforms eventually replaced it with more diverse perspectives. But by discarding a common narrative about the Western culture, schools effectively cut loose the balloon of American identity. Without a shared historical foundation, students began to view themselves as global citizens rather than as a member of a nation with a clear purpose. This shift has influenced Silicon Valley, where leaders no longer feel a strong obligation to support national interests. Instead, they often focus on individual or consumer-based achievements. A cohesive historical narrative has weakened, and common values to address large-scale challenges have been lost. The educational reform on national consciousness bled into long-term effects of indirectly shaping the priorities of today's tech industry. Chapter 8: Flawed Systems. In addition to an educational reform that changed the course of today's unity around national identity, deep-seated distrust of government started to take root during the 60s and 70s. And this has shaped Silicon Valley's present-day mindset. Young innovators were frustrated with slow and bureaucratic government responses during the Vietnam War and civil rights struggles. They began to see technology as a way to free themselves from institutional constraints. For example, Lee Felsenstein and the Homebrew Computer Club championed the idea of personal computers as tools for individual empowerment. This anti-government sentiment was captured in Apple's iconic 1984 commercial, which portrayed a small, innovative computer fighting against a massive, oppressive system. While products like the Macintosh were designed to empower individuals, they also reinforced a belief that big government was inefficient and untrustworthy. As Silicon Valley grew, this attitude evolved into a preference for working on consumer projects rather than engaging with government or defense initiatives. To this day, many tech companies now prefer projects that promise quick market returns, even if these projects do little to address important issues such as infrastructure or security. This reluctance to collaborate with the government is not just a business decision, but a cultural one. The system is flawed in that the same spirit that once fueled groundbreaking innovations shifted to one that values independence and profit over national service. Chapter 9: Lost in Toyland. In the final chapter of Part 2, Karp and Zimiska criticize Silicon Valley for focusing almost entirely on consumer products at the expense of large-scale national projects. During the dot-com boom, eToys was one of many companies that turned to consumer-oriented products in the 1990s. eToys became a symbol of how startups poured vast resources into selling everyday items online to make quick, high returns rather than addressing critical needs like defense or infrastructure. eToys, which once had a market cap of $10 billion and its peak stock price of $85, was eventually decimated to 9 cents a share and filed for bankruptcy. Although many companies like eToys failed, giants like Amazon, Google, and Facebook have grown to dominate global markets. And countless startups continue to chase after quick wins by solving minor consumer problems like apps for ride-sharing, food delivery, or social media. Where are the revolutionary technologies like advanced defense systems or new infrastructure solutions that could truly transform society? While consumer technology is profitable, it lacks the depth and long-term vision required to make a lasting positive impact for the nation. The authors express concern that the narrow focus on consumer markets has left America vulnerable. They warn that other countries are investing in critical technologies that support their governments and strengthening their national security. The culture of Silicon Valley, with its preference for low-risk, high-return projects, may continue to neglect the kinds of innovation needed to support broader public interests. This chapter concludes by urging a rethinking of priorities, a call for a shift back to projects that can yield significant benefits for the nation as a whole. Karp's ideas in Part 2 show why Palantir takes a different path from most tech companies. Unlike many Silicon Valley firms that focus on consumer products, Palantir works closely with the government on defense and intelligence projects. Karp is one of few innovative tech companies that serve national interests, even if it means taking on greater risk or controversy. This strong and unwavering commitment to national security is why Palantir secures long-term government contracts and is dedicated to securing more contracts with the American and European governments. As a Palantir investor myself, and having worked with Fortune 500 companies, I personally believe this strong mission goes a long way. Common traits I've witnessed of companies who succeed in the long term are continuous innovative technology and staying ahead of technological trend, and a mission that does not change just to cater to the market. To me, Palantir possesses these traits, and I believe in their long-term vision. I hope you enjoyed my Part 2 of the summary. Stay tuned for Part 3. Thanks for watching.